corner of my seat, trying not to move. Without looking at him, I groped my way over with my left hand. My arm wasn't long enough, so I did have to slouch over toward him a bit. And I ended up having to glance over once before I had his thing in my hand. I felt so nauseous I wanted to throw up. It was also freezing. I looked through the windshield and tried to concentrate on something else, on the headlights shining through the bushes, or the one neon advertisement that was lit up and that I could still see. It didn't take very long. The guy took out his wallet again. He held it so I could see what was in it. There were a bunch of 500 and 100 mark notes. I guess he wanted to either impress me or bait me for the next time. He gave me another 20, as a tip. Once I was out of the car, I managed to calm myself down, and took stock of the situation. So that was your second man, I thought to myself. You're 14 years old. Barely 4 weeks ago you lost your virginity. And now you're walking the streets as a hooker. But that being said, I stopped worrying about the John, and what I'd just done. I actually felt pretty good. I mean, I had 120 marks in my boot. I'd never had so much money all at once. I wasn't thinking about Ditlev and what he would say. I was already in major withdrawal and was crazy for a fix. I couldn't think of anything except shooting up. I was lucky. I found our regular dealer right away. When he saw the money, he asked, "Hey, where'd you get that? Did you go whoring?" "Shut the fuck up," I told him. "Me and whoring? Before I'd do that, I'd stop using." "Nope, my dad happened to remember that he's got a daughter. He gave me some spending money. For 80 marks I bought 2 little packets, each containing a quarter. It used to be that a quarter gram was enough for 3 of us. But these days, Ditlev and I could manage on that amount. I went to the public bathrooms at the Kurfürstenstrasse and shot up. The dope was first class. The rest of it, along with the leftover 40 marks, I stuffed into the plastic cover of my student bus pass. Doing the job and scoring dope had only taken about 15 minutes. I'd left the apartment about a half an hour before that, so I was sure that Ditlev would still be at the station. I took the subway to the zoo, and sure enough, there was Ditlev. A little pile of misery. It was just like I thought. He hadn't been able to get a customer, not on a Sunday evening, and definitely not while looking so strung out. I went over and said to him, "Come with me, I've got some." He didn't ask from where. He didn't say anything at all. He just wanted to get to the apartment, fast. We went straight into the bathroom. I got out my student bus pass. He opened one of the little packets and emptied the stuff onto a spoon. As he was cooking it up, he stared at the plastic cover of my bus pass, which still held a quarter and 2 20-mark notes. Then he asked the question, "Where'd you get the money?" I said, "Mooching didn't work. It was impossible. There was a guy there with tons of cash, so I gave him a hand job. Seriously, just a hand job. What else could I have done? I did it for you." Even before I'd finished, Ditlev started freaking out. He looked like he was going to go insane. He screamed, "You're lying. Nobody pays 100 for a hand job. You're lying to me. And anyway, what do you mean by only a hand job?" That was it. He didn't have any strength left. He was in full-blown withdrawal. His whole body trembled, his shin was wet with sweat, and his legs were cramping up. He tied off his arm while I sat on the rim of the bathtub, sobbing. I thought that Ditlev was entitled to freak out. I waited for his shot to take effect, still crying. I was sure that once he'd recovered himself, he'd punch me in the face. I wouldn't have even tried to defend myself. Ditlev pulled out the syringe and said nothing. He left the bathroom and I followed. Finally he said, "I'll take you to the bus." I wrapped some of the second quarter for him and gave it to him. He stuck it in his jeans without a word. We walked to the bus stop. Ditlev still didn't say anything. I wanted him to yell at me, to hit me, to do anything or make any kind of sound. I said, "Hey, come on, say something." But from him there was nothing, silence. Even the bus arrived at the bus stop, I didn't get on. After it drove away again, I said, "What I told you was the honest-to-God truth. I just gave him a hand job, and it wasn't so bad. You have to believe me. Or don't you trust me anymore?" Ditlev said, "Okay, I believe you." I added, "You know, I really only did it for you." Ditlev's voice went up a notch. "Stop kidding yourself. You did it for yourself. You had the itch, and you found a way to scratch it. Congratulations. You would have done it even if I hadn't been in the picture. Wake up and smell the coffee, you're a junkie now. You're totally addicted. At this point, anything you do for yourself." I said, "Okay, you're right. But listen, this is the way we have to handle it from now on. You can't do it all by yourself anymore. We need too much dope. And I don't want you to be the only one who works the street. From now on, we'll do it the other way around. I can probably make a pile of cash, especially at first. And I can do it without having real sex. I promise you that I won't be fucking any of the customers." Ditlev didn't say anything. He put his arm around my shoulder. It had started to rain, and I didn't know if the drops running down his face came from the rain or were tears. Another bus came by. I said, "There doesn't seem to be any way out of this mess. Do you remember when we were still just taking pills and smoking pot? We were free. We were totally independent. We didn't need anybody or anything. That's how we felt. I guess things have changed." Another 3 or 4 buses passed while we just talked. It was all sad stuff. I cried and Ditlev held me. Finally he said, "It's going to get better. Someday soon we'll just quit. We'll be able to do it together. Hi, get us some methadone. First thing tomorrow morning, I'll ask someone about methadone. We'll together when we quit." Another bus came and Ditlev pushed me up the steps. At home I did what I did every evening, as if I was on autopilot. I went into the kitchen and got myself a yogurt out of the fridge. I only took the yogurt into my room when I went to bed, so that it wouldn't look weird that I was also taking a spoon. I needed that in the morning to cook up my dope. Then I also got a glass of water out of the bathroom. I could use that to clean the syringe the next morning. When I woke up, everything was the same as ever. My mom woke me at 6:45. I stayed in bed and pretended I didn't hear her. But she popped in every 5 minutes or so until I finally said, "Fine, yes, I'm up, I'm up." She came back in and nagged me, and I counted the minutes till 7:15. That's when she needed to leave the house for work if she didn't want to miss her subway. And she never missed her subway. Actually, I should have left the house at 7:15, too, if I wanted to get to school on time. When I finally heard the front door slam shut, I sprang into action almost automatically. I fished the foil packet out of my jeans, which lay in a heap at the foot of the bed, and then grabbed the plastic bag that lay beside them. Inside the plastic bag was my makeup, a pack of Roth-Handel cigarettes, a small bottle of lemon juice, and a syringe wrapped up in toilet paper. The syringe was almost always clogged, and this time was no different. The damn cigarette tobacco had gotten loose in the bag and plugged up the syringe. I cleaned the needle in the water glass, put the dope on the yogurt spoon, dribbled some lemon juice on it, cooked it up, tied off my arm, and so on. For me, all of this was as natural as a morning cigarette is to other people. After that first shot, I usually fell asleep again and didn't get to school until the second or third class of the day. I was always late when I shot up at home. Sometimes my mom was able to drag me out of bed in time to take me to the subway with her. Then I had to shoot up in the public bathrooms at the Moritz Square subway station. That was pretty unpleasant since the bathrooms there were especially dark and disgusting. The walls had all these little peepholes in them, and on the other side of the wall, there were all these bums and other perverts crouched down, hoping to catch a glimpse of some girl peeing. They got off on it. I was always afraid that they'd call the cops on me, just out of spite because all I ever did was shoot up. I almost always brought the syringe to school with me, too. Just in case. In case someday we had to stay longer for some reason, like maybe for some last-minute event in the auditorium, or if I wasn't able to go home right after school. Occasionally I had to shoot up in the school bathrooms, but the doors to the stalls were all broken. My girlfriend Renate had to hold the door shut for me while I shot up. Renate knew what was going on with me. Most of the kids in my class knew, I think. But they weren't bothered by it. In Gropiusstadt, it wasn't a big deal if you got hooked on drugs. Not anymore. During the classes that I still attended, I daydreamed my time away, staring into space. Sometimes I was even able to fall into a deep sleep, with my head on the desk. If I'd had a lot of dope in the morning, I could barely get a few words out. The teachers must have noticed what was going on with me. But only one of them addressed the topic of narcotics with me and asked me about my problems. The others just treated me like a lazy, narcoleptic student and failed me. We had so many teachers, and they had so many students, that most of them were happy just to know our names. There was hardly any personal interaction. They didn't even bring up the fact that I never did homework anymore. And the only time they took out their grading ledger was when during exams all I'd write was, "Can't do it." After that, I'd hand in the blank exam and then just sit there doodling. I think most of the teachers weren't any more interested in school than I was. Like me, they'd become totally resigned. Their only goal was to just get through each class period without provoking a riot. After that first night with the guy in the car, everything went back to normal. At least for a while. Every day I bugged Ditlev to let me help him bring in some more cash. I wanted to have access to more than just the few odd marks I could scramble together by borrowing. Ditlev was jealous, and it showed. But he'd realized a while ago that we couldn't keep going on that way and suggested that we do it together, as a team. He'd gotten to know the regular station clients pretty well and knew that there were a few bisexuals and even some homosexual guys who would want to try it with a girl for a change, as long as a guy was there also, just in case. Ditlev said he'd pick out some customers who wouldn't need to touch me and who definitely wouldn't want to have sex with me. In other words, customers who had a kink who wanted something done to them. Those were the ones Ditlev liked best, anyway. He thought we could make about 100 marks a pop working together. The first customer that Ditlev settled on for us was this guy Max who we called Stutter Maximum. He was a regular customer of Ditlev's, and I'd gotten to know him pretty well, too. Ditlev said that all he wanted to do was have someone whip him. I just had to take my top off. That was fine with me. I even thought the whipping was a good idea because it would give me a chance to release some of the anger that I felt in general for Ditlev's customers. Stutter Max was totally into the idea of me coming along when Ditlev suggested it. Of course, it would cost him twice as much. We made a date for Monday at 3 p.m. at the zoo. I was late, as always, and Stutter Max was already there. Ditlev wasn't, but that was no surprise. Like all junkies, he was totally unreliable. I had a suspicion that he'd gone off with another customer before our appointment at the zoo, and that turned out to be exactly what had happened. This other guy apparently paid well, and so he had to spend some extra time with him. Stutter Max and I waited for almost half an hour, but Ditlev still didn't show up. I was terrified. But Stutter Max was even more scared than I was, and it showed. He explained that for more than 10 years he hadn't done anything with a girl. He could barely get a word out, but that didn't keep him from trying. He normally stuttered pretty badly, but now he was almost unintelligible. I couldn't stand going over all this right there at the station. Somehow I had to put an end to it. And anyway, I was out of dope and worried about going into withdrawal before this thing with Stutter Max was over. The more nervous he got, the more self-confident I became. I realized that I had a better handle on the situation than he did. Finally I just said to him flatly, "Let's get out of here." Ditlev stood us up. "You'm be happy with just me alone. But the price is still the same, a 150 marks. He stuttered out a yes. His willpower was just gone. I hooked my arm through his and actually had to lead him away. I'd heard all about Stutter Max's sad story from Ditlev. He was originally from Hamburg, and now he was in his late 30s and employed as an unskilled laborer. His mom was a prostitute, and he'd been bullied and beaten up a lot as a kid. By his mom and her pimps, and then later on in all the various foster homes in which he'd been placed. They battered him so badly that he developed a stutter, and now he also needed to be beaten to be able to satisfy himself sexually. We went to his apartment. I asked for the money up front, even though he was a regular, so you didn't really have to take those precautions. He gave me the 150 marks, just like he'd said he would, and it made me feel almost proud of the fact that I was worth that much money to him. I took my t-shirt off, and he gave me the whip. It was like in a movie. I was someone else, not myself. At first I didn't hit him very hard. But he whined and whimpered and begged for more. So at a certain point I just let it rip. He screamed, "Mommy," and God only knows what else. I didn't listen. I tried not to even look. But I saw how the welts swelled up more and more on his body, and then the skin even split open in some spots. It was so gross, and it lasted for almost an hour. When he finally came, I threw on my t-shirt and ran. I ran out of the apartment door and down the stairs and just barely made it. Once in front of the house, I couldn't control my damn stomach any longer and puked. It was all over after I'd vomited. I'd stopped crying and feeling sorry for myself. It had become crystal clear to me that I was the one who had gotten myself into this situation, that I'd fucked up, and now I was stuck in this shit. I went to the station. Ditlev was there. I didn't say much. Just that I'd done the job with Stutter Max by myself. I showed him the 150 marks. He fished a 100-mark note out of his jeans, too, the compensation from his customer. We walked arm in arm to the corner where we were usually able to score first-class stuff from our regular dealer. It was turning into a pretty good day from that point on. I usually earned the cash for my dope on my own. I was a big hit with almost all the customers, and could pick and choose the guys I went with, and also decide on the terms of the agreement. Everyone stayed away from the foreigners because we thought they were pretty sketchy and would cheat you if you weren't paying attention. A lot of time, they would only pay 20 or 30 marks, but they still wanted to have actual intercourse, and without condoms, too. Like all of the other girls at the station, I stayed away from the foreigners, as a general rule. Fucking the customers was still out of the question for me. That was the thing that I hung on to, that I reserved for Ditlev. I stuck to hand jobs and blow jobs. It didn't make me feel too upset, as long as they didn't do anything to me. Under no circumstances were they allowed to put their hands on me. If they did, I would freak out on them. I always tried to negotiate the conditions right there at the station. Guys who pissed me off, right off the bat, didn't even get a chance to negotiate. Preserving my last bit of pride, however, cost me a lot of time. It often took all afternoon to find a customer who'd agree to all my conditions. And we hardly ever had as much money again as we did on that day when I was with Stutter Max for the first time. Max became the first regular customer for Ditlev and me as a team. Sometimes we both went to see him, and other times it was just one of us. Max was actually a pretty okay guy. He loved both of us. Of course, he couldn't keep on paying 150 marks on his workers' wages. But 40 marks, enough for one shot, was an amount that he could always scrape together. Once he even smashed his piggy bank, fished some change out of a bowl, and counted out exactly 40 marks for me. When I was in a hurry, I could stop by at his place and get 20 marks on loan. I told him that I'd be back the next day at a certain time and do it to him for 20. If he still had a 20, he was game. Max was always game, always expecting us. He always kept some of my favorite drink, a kind of peach juice, on hand for me. And for Ditlev he maintained a steady supply of tapioca pudding. Max made the pudding himself. In addition to that, he always prepared a selection of yogurt and chocolates for me because he knew that I liked to eat those after a job. The whippings had become totally routine, and afterward I'd hang out for a while, just eating, drinking, and talking with Maximum. He was getting skinnier and skinnier. He really spent his every last cent on us, to the point where he couldn't buy himself enough to eat anymore. He'd gotten so used to us and was so happy that he hardly stuttered at all when we were with him. He bought himself a couple of newspapers first thing every morning, just to check if there was another notice about someone having died from heroin. Once, when I stopped by his place to borrow another 20 from him, he was stuttering like crazy and pale as a ghost. The newspapers had reported that someone named Ditlev W. had become the umpteenth victim of heroin that year. He pretty much cried with joy when I told him that I'd just seen my Ditlev, and he was very much alive. He blubbered at me, not for the first time, that Ditlev and I should quit heroin, or we'd follow all the other kids to the grave. But I told him, cold as ice, that if we quit heroin, then we wouldn't have any reason to come and see him anymore. After that he let it drop. Ditlev and I had a funny relationship with Maximum. We hated all the Johns, without exception, so we also hated Maximum. But if we really thought about it, we couldn't deny that, all in all, he was an okay guy. Our response to him probably did have a lot to do with the fact that he was always good for 40 marks. But then again, I'm also positive that we really did feel sorry for him. He was using us for his own sexual satisfaction, but he was also worse off than we were. He was so lonely. We were the only people with whom he had any kind of relationship. But we didn't care enough to really think that deeply about him at the time. It wasn't going to be the only time that we ruined one of our customers. Sometimes we'd get comfortable watching TV in Max's apartment and then wind up staying the night. He let us use his bed and slept on the floor himself. One night we got a little wild. Max put on some crazy music that he liked, and pulled on a long wig and a ridiculous fur coat. Then he danced like a crazy person, which made us all laugh hysterically. But then, out of nowhere, he tripped, fell, and hit his head on his sewing machine. For a few minutes, he was out cold. We were scared to death and called a doctor. It turned out that Max had a concussion and had to stay in bed for 2 weeks. Shortly after that, he was fired from his job. He was a wreck, completely devastated and hopeless. Without his having ever tried dope, it had still ruined him. We had ruined him. He begged us to visit him at least sometimes, just as friends. But friendly visits like that just weren't possible. Not for us. At this point, Ditlev was incapable of caring about anyone else. That was the first thing. But also, he was busy all day trying to scrape together enough cash for his next fix and didn't really have any time for that sort of sentimental stuff. Ditlev laid this out for Max in pretty stark terms after Max promised to give us plenty of cash as soon as he had some again. A junkie's like a businessman, Ditlev said. Every day he has to take care of his bottom line so that he doesn't end up in the red. He just can't afford to extend credit out of friendship or sympathy. Shortly after I started working the street, I had a nice little reunion. It happened at the station. I was waiting for some customers, and suddenly Babsy was right next to me. Babsy, my friend, and that same little girl who had hit me up for some acid just a few months earlier. Babsy, just 12 years old back then and already on the run because of some trouble back in school. The same girl who'd tried a few quick snorts of H before she was picked up and taken back to her grandparents' place. We looked at each other, recognized immediately what was up, fell into each other's arms, and kissed. She was overjoyed and so was I. Babsy had gotten crazy skinny. No boobs and no butt. But she almost looked more beautiful. Her shoulder-length, blonde hair was healthy and sleek, and her clothes were chic and polished. I knew from first glance that she was also an addict. I didn't even have to look into her pin-size pupils. But I could still believe that, if you didn't know what heroin did to people, you would. We never in a million years guessed that this pretty girl was already an addict, already a junkie. Babsy was almost unbelievably calm. She wasn't at all like the other junkies, hectic people like me, who chased after money and dope all day. And right away, she told me that I didn't need to do a customer right then, that she'd buy me a shot and something to eat. We went upstairs to the zoo station cafe. We didn't bother talking about how we were both doped up all the time or what our lives were like now, as prostitutes. But at the same time, I was really curious about how Babsy got so much cash and dope, and she wouldn't tell me. She only said that ever since she'd been brought home again she'd been under a strict watch. She had to be home before 8 every night and also go to school regularly. Her grandmother kept an eagle eye on her. I finally asked her about her money more directly, and she said, "Yeah, I have a regular customer. He's kind of old but very cool. I take the taxi to him in the afternoons. He pays me in dope, not cash. I get 3/4 from him each day. He's got other girls, too, and they also get their dope directly from him. But for the moment he only likes me. I'm done in an hour. No sex, of course. Only stripping and talking. I let him take pictures of me, we talk, and, well, blowjobs. But sex is out of the question for me." The name of her regular was Heinz. He owned a stationery store. I'd heard of him before. He was cool because he paid directly with H, so that you could save yourself the trouble of running around, finding a dealer, and buying the dope. I was jealous of Babsy, who was home by 8 at the latest, always got a good night's sleep, and lived without all this stressful, hectic running around. Babsy had everything. Even a stash of syringes. Although syringes were actually supposed to be thrown away after one use, back then they were so hard to get that you had to hold on to them. Mine had become so dull that I had to constantly sharpen it on the rough surface of a matchbox so that it was still possible to slam the thing into my vein. Babsy had plenty of syringes. Without a second thought she promised me 3 of them. Then a few days later, I ran into Stella, Babsy's girlfriend and old couch surfing buddy. She'd started using H even before Babsy did. Hugs, kisses, and another round of real happiness. Stella was also hooked, of course. But she wasn't doing as well as Babsy. Her mom had opened a bar together with her Italian boyfriend and started drinking. Stella had always swiped cash from the bar for her dope. Then when she stole 50 marks directly out of her mom's boyfriend's wallet, it all came out. She couldn't go home anymore and had started just bumming around the city again. In the station cafe again, it didn't take long before we started talking about customers. Stella first of all enlightened me about Babsy. She was already scraping the dregs and was in a pretty fucked up situation. This guy Hines turned out to be a real scumbag. A filthy, mean, old, fat, sweaty guy, whom she was definitely having sex with. Stella said, that would be the absolute worst for me. To let someone like that actually fuck you. To let any customer fuck you. I mean, at that point you and he got no standards, you'll go away with anyone. A blowjob here and there, well, okay. But sex for pay is the final frontier, that's when you know you're at the end of the line. I was really shocked to hear how bad things had gotten with Babsy. At the time, I didn't really think to ask why Stella knew all these details and why she was telling me. But later on, Babsy told me that Hines used to be Stella's regular. That's why Stella knew exactly what he demanded in return for those 3 quarters. I'd eventually learn that for myself, too, later on. Stella then told me how disgusting she thought it was to a hooker at Zoo Station, that's only for the real fuck-ups. I'd never want to deal with those assholes over there. Stella worked the Kurfürstenstrasse, where cars passed by slowly and picked up child prostitutes. Most of the girls who waited around there were 13 and 14-year-olds, all hooked on heroin. I had an overwhelming fear of getting picked up by a car because then you couldn't really check out beforehand who your client was. Now that's where things are really bad. That's where the girls do it for 20 marks. 2 customers for 1 shot. No way. We kept at each other for almost an hour, arguing about whether it was worse to be a child prostitute at Zoo Station or on Kurfürstenstrasse. In the meantime, we did at least agree that if Babsy was really fucking that filthy old man, then she was in a very bad way. So our reunion began with a fight over our honor as hookers. This was a fight that Babsy, Stella, and I continued to have almost every day over the next few months. The central question was always which one of us had it the worst. And none of us could ever admit, either to ourselves or the others, how low we were sitting on the food chain. When only 2 of us were together, we always talked shit about the third. The best thing to do, of course, would be to find a way to get by without having to deal with the customers at all. On the first day of our reunion, Stella and I convinced ourselves that we could do just that. We'd get the cash we needed by begging, borrowing, and stealing. Stella had a whole arsenal of tricks up her sleeve. We went straight to the department store of the West 26 to try out her new trick. It involved the women's restroom. To pull this off, you had to wait until a couple of old ladies disappeared into the stalls. After they went in, they'd usually hang their handbags on the inside door handles. Then, once they'd peeled themselves out of their corsets and pantyhose and plopped down onto the toilet seat, you'd yank down the outside door handles. The handbags would drop down and then you could easily pull them out through the gap beneath the door. The old ladies wouldn't dare come out with their pants down, so to speak, and by the time they'd reassembled all their clothes and put everything back on, you'd be long gone. So, there we were, hanging out in the ladies' room at the department store. But every time Stella whispered, "Now," I got scared. It wasn't something that she wanted to do on her own. And besides, you really needed 4 hands for this job. So the great ladies' bathroom robbery was off. I was pretty anxious about stealing from the outset, and the longer it dragged on, the worse my nerves got. After a few more misadventures in petty larceny, with supplemental small-time loans, Stella and I decided to go back to working the street, but this time around we were going to be a team. I insisted that we work Zoo Station, but we'd only go with a customer if he agreed to take on both of us. That had several advantages, although we'd never admit it. This arrangement provided us with a sense of security because we'd be able to see exactly how far the other was willing to go, and stop ourselves short accordingly. We'd always be at the same level. But we also felt safer. With two of us involved, it was harder to rip us off, and we could defend ourselves better if a customer didn't want to stick to the agreement. And it was quicker with two. One of us kept the guy busy up top, the other down below, and the whole thing was over and done much faster. On the other hand, it was way harder to find customers who could afford to pay for two girls. And there were also all the experienced Johns who were simply afraid to deal with two junkie brides at once because it was also easier for us to rip off a customer if we were double teaming him. While one of us kept him busy, the other could get at his wallet. Stella was the one who liked the arrangement the best, whether it was with Babsy or me. She had more trouble attracting customers by herself because she didn't look as young as we did anymore. It was the easiest for Babsy. Even when she still had Heinz, she earned some money on the side just to be able to treat us to dope. She never put makeup on her innocent baby face. Without a butt or boobs, and just barely 13, she was just the kind of baby prostitute the customers were looking for. Incredibly, to us, she once made 200 marks in just a single hour, with 5 different customers. Babsy and Stella blended right into our social group, which of course still included Dittelf, Axel, and Bernd. So now we were 3 girls and 3 boys. When we went out together, I went arm in arm with Dittelf, and the other 2 boys each grabbed one of the girls. There was nothing going on between them. We just all really liked each other. Each of us could still talk about his or her life and problems with any of the others, despite the many fights we had over little things, just like any other group of heroin friends. During this phase of our lives, heroin simultaneously caused all our problems but also kept us all together. I'm not sure that this son of friendship, the kind we had in our little group, could exist among kids who weren't addicted to drugs. And in all honesty, that kind of desperate closeness seemed like it impressed a lot of other young people. People looked up to us. My relationship with Dittelf started to get rocky when the 2 girls joined our group. We still loved each other, but we got into a lot more fights. Dittelf was often irritable, so I spent a lot of time with Babsy and Stella, and he didn't really like that. But what really pissed him off was the fact that he didn't have any control over which customers I was going with anymore. I was now picking them on my own, or together with Stella or Babsy. Dittelf started to accuse me of having sex with the customers. He was really jealous. I now had a more relaxed view of my relationship with Dittelf. I loved him, of course, and would always love him. On the other hand, I wasn't dependent on him anymore. I didn't need his dope or his protection. Actually, our relationship had become similar to a modern marriage, with no one holding power over the other. We were equals. We girls got used to treating each other to dope when one of us had a little extra, and the guys did the same thing. But our friendships were still entirely dependent on heroin, when it really came down to it. We all became more and more aggressive from one week to the next. The dope and our frantic lifestyle, the daily struggle for money and age, the constant stress at home, the cover-ups and the lies that we used to fool our parents, it all wreaked havoc on our nerves. It was also getting harder and harder to manage all the little grudges that we'd developed toward one another over time. I got along best with Babsy, who was still the calmest one of us. We worked together a lot. We bought ourselves the same tight black skirts, with long slits in them. Underneath we wore black nylon stockings with black lace garters. That really turned the customers on. Shortly before Christmas 1976, my dad went on vacation, and he let Babsy and me sleep in his apartment, along with my little sister. On the first night there, we got into a huge fight. Babsy and I were so nasty to each other that my sister, who was only a year younger than me, started to cry. We really had that street talk down, and it came out in a fight. And my sister of course had no clue about our double lives. The next morning, Babsy and I were best friends again. It was always the same, after we'd had some sleep and started to come down again, we were usually in a pretty peaceful mood. Babsy and I made a deal to postpone shooting up that morning for as long as possible. We'd tried this out a few times already. It had become a kind of sport, to wait until you couldn't wait any longer to shoot up. However, we couldn't talk about anything else except the awesome high we were about to get, anytime we wanted to, with this great, first-class dope. We were like kids on Christmas right before our parents let us open our presents. My sister knew that something was up. It didn't take her long to figure out that we had some kind of drug. But she didn't have any idea that we were addicted. She thought we were just experimenting. She sincerely promised not to tell my dad or mom, and to keep her mouth shut if someone from Babsy's family came by unexpectedly. Babsy's family was very strict with her, and neither her grandparents nor her parents had the slightest inkling that she was a heroin junkie and a hooker to boot. Babsy reached into her purse and took out her strawberry-flavored powder called quarkfane. She had a real addiction to this stuff, which is a kind of powdered flavoring you can mix into dairy products like cottage cheese. She pretty much lived on cottage cheese with quarkfane. My diet wasn't much more varied than that. Besides cottage cheese, I also ate yogurt and pudding and Viennese rings, a pastry you could get in the Kurfürstendamm subway station. By that point my stomach would reject pretty much anything else. So Babsy was mixing up her strawberry-flavored cottage cheese in the kitchen, which was like a religious ritual for her. Meanwhile, my sister and I sat and watched her with appropriate reverence, all of us in happy anticipation of our huge, pink, cottage cheese breakfast. But obviously we weren't going to be able to eat until after Babsy and I had shot up. Even Babsy had whipped the cottage cheese into a really creamy confection. We couldn't stand it anymore. We told my sister that she should go ahead and set the table, and then we went and locked ourselves into the bathroom. We hadn't been there for more than 2 seconds when the drama started up between us because we were starting to go into withdrawal. We only had one usable syringe left, and I said that I wanted to shoot up first, just real quick. But Babsy already had an edge on. Why do you always get to go first? Today I should start. After all, I was the one who got the dope. That really rubbed me the wrong way. I couldn't stand it when she tried to gain an advantage like that. There were a lot of times when she'd have more dope than the rest of us, and she would always get like this. I said, Jesus, don't freak out. It just takes you forever. It was true. This girl needed like half an hour before she was done. She hardly had any veins left. And when she'd get the needle in and couldn't draw any blood, she'd freak out. She'd slam the needle into her skin again and again, getting more frantic by the minute. The only thing that she could hope for then, that would put a stop to her frenzy, was a lucky hit. It still went pretty smoothly for me back then. If Ditloff didn't do the shot for me, he was the only one I'd let near my veins, then I'd always aim for a spot in the crook of my left arm. That worked well until the day I got a thrombosis there, which ruined that vein for me. But later on, I also got to the point where I didn't know where to stick the needle anymore. I got my way though, for that morning anyway. Babsy was totally pissed. I got the syringe, immediately hit a vein, and was done in a literally over 2 minutes. It was a really fucking awesome shot. My blood was rushing like a river through my body. I got really hot. I went to the sink, let water run over my face, and then happily, absent-mindedly fussed with my hair and clothes. Babsy sat on the rim of the bathtub, plunging the thing into her arm again and again, and freaking out. Shit, she screamed. VVHYs, there's no air in this dump. Open that damn window. I said, you'll just have to get used to it. Get off my case, will you? I didn't care at all about what was going on with her. I'd had my shot and everything was okay. Babsy was squirting blood everywhere, but she wasn't hitting any veins. She was seriously freaking out now. She screamed, "There's no light in this fucking bathroom. Get me some light. Get that lamp from the kids at Nom." I was too lazy to go out and get the lamp for Babsy. But eventually, after she kept going on about it, yelling and generally making a racket, I got worried that my sister would notice and went out to grab the stupid lamp. Then, finally, Babsy did it. She immediately calmed down. She cleaned the syringe and wiped the blood out of the bathtub and off the floor. She didn't say another word. We went into the kitchen, and by that point, I was really looking forward to the quark fein. But Babsy grabbed the bowl, wrapped one arm tightly around it, and started to shovel it in. She actually forced down the entire bowl full of cottage cheese. The only time she even looked up was to say, "You know why?" We'd both really looked forward to those days together in my dad's apartment, and the first morning had started with the fight of the century. And all of it over nothing. But we were heroin addicts, after all. And all heroin addicts turned out like this sooner or later. Dope destroys relationships among people, even with us. Despite how young we were, and how close we'd been. Despite the fact that, even then, I still believed that no one could ever be as close as we had been. My fights with Ditlev got nastier also. Both of us had physically deteriorated a lot already. I was about 5'5", but I was down to under 100 pounds, and Ditlev, who was 5'9", was down to 119 pounds. We felt sick all the time, and then everything got on our nerves, and we were deliberately vicious to one another. When we insulted each other, we always went for the jugular and tried to say whatever would hit the other person at the deepest level. Since we were both so ashamed of what we did with our bodies, and even though we both pretended that hooking was just a part-time thing, prostitution was usually the topic that we focused on. Ditlev would say something like, "Do you really think I want to sleep with someone who sleeps with such nasty scumbags all the time?" And then I'd respond with something like, "I'm not the one who gets butt fucked." And so on. Most of the time, one or both of us would end up crying. And when one of us was going into withdrawal, then the other could really tear him or her down, until there was almost nothing left. It didn't make things any better that at some point we'd inevitably huddle together, clinging to one another like two little kids. Things had gotten so bad, between us girls and now also between Ditlev and me, that we could see our own miserable, shitty selves reflected in the other. Each one of us hated the rotten mess he or she had become, and therefore attacked that same rotten mess in everyone else. It was all part of a feeble attempt to prove that we weren't as bad off yet as everybody else. This aggressiveness would of course also get vented on strangers. I already lost my mind whenever I walked onto a subway platform. They were packed full of old ladies holding onto their shopping bags. To start things off, I'd usually get into a non-smoking car with a lit cigarette. Even the old ladies started muttering under their breath. I told them to switch to another compartment if they didn't like it in this one. I especially enjoyed stealing a seat right out from under one of their noses. The stunts that I pulled would sometimes set off pandemonium in the entire train compartment, and occasionally wound up with me being removed from the train and forced to get some fresh air. The way I behaved even got on my own nerves. It also got on my nerves when Babsy and Stella behaved like that. I didn't want to have anything to do with those drab, tedious old people. I didn't even want to fighting with them. But I couldn't help myself and kept doing it. I didn't give a shit what strangers thought of me. When I got the itch, when it was bad and I itched all over, then I scratched the itch, no matter where I was at that moment. It didn't matter whether it was under tight clothes or even beneath my makeup, I got at it. It didn't bother me to take my boots off in the subway or lift my skirt up to my belly button if I needed to scratch myself. The only people whose opinion mattered were the people in our clique. There comes a time when junkies don't care about anything anymore. That's when they start to turn solitary. I knew a few of the old junkies who'd been shooting up for 5 years or longer and had somehow survived. Way harder mixed relationship with the old veterans. To us, these loner types were almost celebrities, but not in a good way. Everybody knew them though, and it made an impression on other people when you could tell them that you knew one of those guys. On the other hand, I despised them because they were all totally wrecked, ruined, fucked up. Above all of us kids were absolutely terrified of them because they didn't have any morals, conscience, or compassion left. They would hit their best friend over the head with a rock if he was standing in the way of a fix. The most infamous one of them all was Rip-Off Man. Everybody called him that because he was the absolute worst and was always on the hunt. Even the dealers saw him coming, they scattered quicker than during a police raid. When he got hold of a small-time dealer, he took everything, all of his dope. Nobody dared put up a fight. Least of all some young junkie. I'd once seen Rip-Off Man in full action. I'd just locked myself into a public toilet stall and was about to shoot up when somebody leaped over the dividing wall and landed right on top of me. It was him. I knew from the stories the others told that this was his MO. He'd wait in a bathroom until a girl with H came in, and then he'd pounce. And I knew how brutal he could be. So without any resistance, I gave him my syringe and my dope. He walked right out of the stall and stopped in front of the mirror. He wasn't afraid of anything or anybody anymore. He slammed the shot right into his neck. He didn't have a single spot left on his body that he could shoot into. He bled like a stuck pig. I thought maybe he'd hit the main artery. But he wouldn't have cared if he did. He just said, "Thanks a lot," and left. I was sure that I'd never get to that point at least. In order to survive as long as Rip-Off Man had, you had to be a really tough, ruthless character. And I just wasn't. I couldn't even get myself to swipe some old lady's handbags in the department store bathroom. The world of our clique revolved more and more around our shared profession. The boys had the same problems that the girls had. We still had mutual interests and could help each other out by exchanging information. We girls swapped stories about our experiences with customers. The field of customers that we had contact with was very limited. So when a customer was new to me, it was still likely that Stella or Babsy had already been with him. And then it was to my advantage to know what their experiences had been like. There were recommended customers, less recommended customers, and then there were the problem clients. We never bothered with personal feelings. We also didn't care about his job or if he was married, etc. We never talked about the personal nonsense the customers unloaded on us. All we cared about was what they were able to pay. A customer was considered advantageous if he was terrified of STDs and wouldn't do anything without a condom. Unfortunately, those guys were few and far between, despite the fact that most girls working the streets caught a disease sooner or later, and even then they were afraid to go to a doctor, especially if they were DMG addicts. Another advantage was if you found a guy who knew what he wanted and asked for it, right from the start, especially if he only wanted a blowjob. Then you didn't have to spend hours haggling over everything. We also gave points to a customer who was relatively young and not disgustingly fat, and also of course if he didn't treat you like a piece of meat but like an actual human being and remained somewhat friendly, possibly even invited you to an occasional meal. The most important criterion in determining the quality of a customer was, of course, how much money he paid and for which services. The ones to be avoided were the guys who didn't keep up their end of the agreement or who suddenly tried to threaten or bribe you into doing more stuff with them. What we really kept an eye out for though, and warned each other about, was the kind of sleazy guy who would ask for his money back often, or sometimes even force us to give it back, because he supposedly wasn't satisfied with us. The boys, though, had more trouble with scumbags like that than we did. Somehow or other, the year 1977 finally rolled around. Time didn't seem to compute in my brain anymore. Neither it was winter or summer, whether the rest of the world was celebrating Christmas or New Year's, to me one day was just like the next. The only good thing about Christmas was that I got some money, and so I didn't have to do as many customers. That was especially important over the holidays, when business was slow. I was totally numb in this phase. I didn't think about anything. Nothing at all. I didn't feel anything and didn't notice anything around me. I was totally preoccupied with myself. But I didn't know who I was. Sometimes I didn't even know if I was still alive or not. I can hardly remember any specific details from that period. There probably wasn't anything worth remembering anyway, that is, until one Sunday at the end of January. I came home sometime in the early morning hours. I was feeling pretty good, actually. I lay in my bed and drifted off, imagining that I was a young girl who'd just gotten home from a dance. At this dance, my alter ego had just met a super cute boy, and she already had a huge crush on him. I only felt when I was dreaming, and in my dreams I became a completely different person. My favorite dream was one in which I was just a happy, carefree teenager. The teenager in that dream reminded me of someone in a Coca-Cola advertisement. My mom woke me up around noon and brought me some lunch. When I was home on Sundays, that is, on the Sundays when I wasn't with Dittelf, my mom always brought me lunch in bed. I choked down a couple of bites. It was almost impossible for me to get anything down anymore, except for yogurt, cottage cheese, and pudding. Then I grabbed my white handbag. It was already pretty shredded, no handles anymore and with holes everywhere. That shouldn't have been a surprise, though, because in addition to syringes and cigarettes, I'd also stuffed my jacket in there. It didn't even occur to me to get a new handbag, that's how little I cared about everything. I was so far past caring that I didn't even think twice about shuffling past my mom to the bathroom, shredded bag in hand. I locked the bathroom door behind me. Nobody in our family locked the bathroom door. I looked in the mirror, just like I did every day. A totally strange sunken face stared back at me. It had been a long time since I'd been able to recognize myself in the mirror. That face wasn't mine. Neither was this emaciated pgo. It was a body that was totally foreign to me. I couldn't even feel it when I was sick. It just went its own way. The heroin made me numb to any pain or hunger, even to a high fever. The body only registered one thing: withdrawal. I stood in front of the mirror and prepared the shot. I was pretty anxious about it because I had powder. In contrast to the white or tan dope that you usually got on the market, this was a grey-green speckled powder. It's generally very impure 27, but it gives you an incredible kick. It's supposed to be like a flash. It goes right to the heart, and you have to be really careful with the dosage. Too much of it, and you're a goner. I knew the danger, but I still wanted it. I needed it. I was dead set on experiencing that kick from this powder. I pushed the needle into the vein, pulled back, and immediately drew blood. I had filtered the powder a couple of times, but it was still extremely impure. And then it happened. The needle clogged. That's about the worst thing that can happen, if the needle gets plugged up right at that moment. Because then there's nothing else for you to do. You have to throw away the dope. So I couldn't pull out anymore. I pushed as hard as I could to get the shit through the needle. And I was lucky. I got the shot to go in. I drew back once more in order to get the rest of it into the vein, but then the needle clogged again. I was furious. I only had 8 or 10 seconds before it hit me. So I pushed with all my strength. The syringe popped out of my hand and blood squirted everywhere. The flash was insane. I had to hold on to my head. I felt an unbelievable cramp in my chest, right where my heart was. There was a roaring in my head, as if someone had hit it with a sledgehammer, and my scalp tingled as if pricked by a million needles. My left arm was virtually paralyzed. Even I could move again. I grabbed some Kleenex to wipe up the blood. It was everywhere, in the sink, on the mirror, and all over the walls. Luckily our whole bathroom was covered with an oil-based paint, so the blood came off pretty easily. While I was still wiping up the blood, my mom banged on the door. She immediately started in on me. Open the door. Let me in. Why'd you lock the door, anyway? That's unacceptable, Christiane. Shut up, I called back. I'm almost finished. I was super pissed that she was bugging me now, of all times, while I was wiping frantically at the walls with the tissues. In my panic, I missed a few bloody spots and even left a bloody tissue in the sink. I unlocked the door and my mom burst past me into the bathroom. I was totally unsuspecting and just thought she had to pee. I went into my room with my handbag, lay down on my bed, and lit a cigarette. No sooner had I lit it than my mom came running into the room. "You're taking narcotics," she screamed at me. I said, "What? What gave you that idea?" She then practically threw herself on top of me and forced my arms straight. I didn't put up any resistance. She saw the fresh needle marks immediately. She took my handbag and dumped everything out onto the bed. Out came the syringe, some loose tobacco from the Roth handle cigarettes, and a whole pile of small foil squares which used to contain my heroin. When I'd go into withdrawal and didn't have any dope, I'd use a nail file to scrape the last bits of dust from the paper to get one more shot out of it. The stuff that fell out of my bag was proof positive that I was an addict. It had already become clear to her in the bathroom though. Not only did she find the bloody tissue and blood splatters, but also some soot from the spoon in which I cooked up the dope. She had already read a lot about heroin in the papers, and she'd put two and two together now. Denying it was useless, so I gave up trying. Although I'd just given myself a really awesome shot of powder, I broke down and cried. I sobbed so hard that I couldn't get out a single word. My mom didn't say anything either. She was shaking. She was totally shocked. She left my room, and I heard her talking with her boyfriend, Klaus. Then she came back. She seemed a little calmer and asked, "Can't anything be done about this? Don't you want to get off that stuff?" I said, "Mom, there's nothing I'd rather do. Seriously. You have to believe me. I really want to get away from all this." She said, "Good. Then we'll try it together. I'll take vacation days so that I can be with you the whole time, while you're going through withdrawal. We'll start today, right now." "That's great. But there's this one thing. Without Ditlev I can't do it. I need him and he needs me. And anyway, he also wants to get off the stuff. We've talked about it for a while now. We were just waiting for the right time to do it together." My mom was completely stunned. "Oh, Ditlev. Him too?" she asked, in a weak voice. She'd always liked Ditlev and was proud that I'd found such a nice boyfriend. "Of course, Ditlev too," I said. "Do you think that I would have done this all by myself? Ditlev never would have let me. But he also won't let me suffer from withdrawal without him either." I suddenly felt much better, almost cheerful. The thought of Ditlev and me getting clean together really made me optimistic. After all, we'd been talking about it for a long time. But my mom was completely devastated. Her face turned a pale green color, and I thought she was going to have a nervous breakdown. The news about Ditlev had given her another shock. She was probably stunned by her own naivete and gullibility over the last 2 years as well. And now there were more doubts haunting her. She wanted to know how I came by the money for the heroin. Of course, she immediately thought working the street, prostitution, etc. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. So I lied. Oh, I just asked people for a few marks here and there. And most of the time it worked. Then I also cleaned people's apartments or offices, off and on. My mom didn't pry any further. Once again she seemed very relieved that she got an answer that didn't confirm her worst fears. What she'd already found out on this particular Sunday was enough to totally devastate her. I felt truly sorry for my mom. It made me feel very guilty. We drove off immediately to look for Ditlev. He wasn't at Zoo Station, and he wasn't at Axel and Burns either. In the evening, we went to see Ditlev's dad. Ditlev's parents were also divorced. His dad was a government official. He'd known for a long time what was up with Ditlev. My mom criticized him for not telling her about what was going on. That's when he almost broke down and cried. He was incredibly embarrassed about the fact that his son was a drug-addled prostitute. But he was glad that my mom wanted to do something about it. He repeated over and over, "Yes, we've got to do something." Ditlev's dad had a whole bunch of sleeping pills and sedatives that he kept in his desk drawer. He gave them all to me because I told him that we didn't have any methadone, and that it would be absolute hell to try and get clean without any chemical assistance. On the subway ride back home, I tossed down a whole handful of pills, because I could feel the withdrawal symptoms coming on. And then with all those pills in my system I felt pretty good and slept through the night. The next morning, Ditlev showed up at our doorstep. His dad had found him right away, and he was already in full withdrawal. I thought that was pretty courageous of him that he hadn't tried to give himself one last fix and arrived in the same state I was in. He must have known that I didn't have any more dope. And he said he wanted to be at the same level as me when we started going clean. He was a genuinely good and considerate guy. So Ditlev definitely wanted to get off the stuff just as bad as I did. And he was also glad that it was happening this way. Both of us were, like our parents, ignorant of just how stupid it is to have two addicts, who are also friends, trying to quit together. Because at some point one of them will get the other one going again, and they'll work each other up to the next shot. Well, maybe we did have some idea, just from the stories we'd heard. But then again, we were living within our own world of illusions. We always believed that whatever applied to other drug addicts somehow didn't apply to us. And anyway, we couldn't imagine doing anything of importance without the other. Over the course of the morning, we were able to keep our heads above water with the pills from Ditlev's dad. We could still talk to each other. We painted a fantastically upbeat picture of our future after we'd gotten clean, and we promised each other to stay tough and brave through the next few days. Despite the pain that we were starting to feel, we were still pretty happy. In the afternoon though, we were in the thick of it. We kept popping those pills and chasing them down with wine, lots of wine. But it didn't help. I lost control of my legs. There was this huge pressure on the back of my knees. I lay down flat on the floor and stretched out my legs, trying to alternately tense and relax the leg muscles. But they were beyond my control at that point. I pressed the legs against the dresser, and that's where they stayed. I couldn't move them after that. I was rolling around on the floor, but my feet somehow stayed glued to the dresser. I was soaked through and through with an icy cold sweat. I was freezing and shaking, and the cold sweat ran down my face into my eyes. I reeked. I thought, this is that nasty, evil poison that's coming out of your body. It seemed to me like I was going through my very own exorcism. Ditlev was even worse off than me. He was almost going berserk. He was shivering with cold, but then he suddenly took off his sweater. He sat down on my chair by the window. His legs were in constant motion. They were running while he was sitting. His pencil-thin legs twitched like they were possessed, up and down, up and down. And he kept wiping the sweat from his face, his whole body shaking terribly. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill shivering anymore. Again and again, he doubled over and screamed. It was stomach cramps. Ditlev smelled even worse than me. That whole tiny room was full of our stink. I thought about what I'd heard, that friendships between heroin addicts always fall apart after a successful withdrawal. I also thought that even now I still loved Ditlev, even though he smelled absolutely horrible. Ditlev got up, somehow made it over to the mirror in my room, and said, "I can't take it anymore. I can't do it. I just can't do it." I couldn't answer. I didn't have enough strength to bolster him up or give him courage. I tried not to think those thoughts. Instead, I tried to focus on a stupid story, frantically turning the pages of a newspaper over and over again and tearing it apart in the process. My mouth and my throat were totally dry. But in a weird way, my mouth was also full of saliva. I couldn't swallow and started to cough. The harder I tried to swallow it, the more violently I coughed. I got a coughing fit that just wouldn't stop. Then I started throwing up. I threw up all over my rug. It all came out as white foam. I thought, just like my dog used to do after she ate some grass. The coughing and the puking went on and wouldn't stop. My mom was in the living room through most of this. When she came into our room, she was completely helpless. She kept running to the shopping center to get something for us, but we couldn't swallow anything anyway. At around this time though, she brought me some cough drops, and these did actually help a little bit. The coughing stopped. My mama cleaned up the vomit. She was so sweet. And I couldn't even say thank you. At some point, and I don't know when, the pills and the wine started to work. I'd swallowed 5 Valium and 2 Quaaludes, and on top of that downed almost a whole bottle of wine. Any normal person would have slept for a few days after that. My body, however, was so thoroughly poisoned that it hardly reacted. But at least I was able to calm down enough so that I could lie down on my bed. We'd set up a cot, too, for Ditlev, and he lay down on that. We didn't touch. We were each way too preoccupied with what was going on with ourselves. I drifted off into a kind of waking sleep. I slept but at the same time was aware that I slept, and was also fully aware of my pain. I dreamt and thought things over. It was all muddled together. I thought that everyone, especially my mom, could see right through me. That everyone could read my horrible, evil thoughts. That everyone had to see what a revolting piece of shit I really was. I hated my body. I would have been glad if it had simply died on me right then. At night I took a few more pills. Again, any normal person would have probably been dead at that point, but I just fell asleep for a couple of hours. I woke up after a dream about my life as a dog. I'd always been treated kindly by people before, but now I was being thrown into a kennel to be tortured to death. Ditlev was flinging his arms around and hitting me. The light was on. Next to my bed was a large bowl of water and a washcloth. My mom had put it there. I washed the sweat off my face. Ditlev's whole body was in motion, even though he seemed to be out cold. His body was bucking up and down, his legs were kicking, and sometimes his arms would shoot out, too. I seemed to be a little better off than he was. I could at least manage to wipe Ditlev's forehead down with the washcloth. He didn't feel a thing though. I still loved him like crazy. Later, after I dozed off again, I was half aware of Ditlev reaching out to me and stroking my hair. The next morning, we both felt better though. Apparently, the old rule about the second day of withdrawal being the worst didn't hold true for us. But of course, this was our first time going cold turkey for any extended period of time, and your first time was supposed to be much less difficult by half, even, than all the later attempts. Around noon, we even started talking again. First about trivial stuff, but then, later on, about our future as well. Our plans lost their domestic theme from earlier. Now we swore to never, ever do heroin again, no LSD and no pills either. We wanted to live a peaceful life with peaceful people. We agreed that pot was okay, just like it during that time when everything seemed so wonderful. We also wanted our friends to be from pot-smoking circles, as those kinds of people were mostly very laid back. We thought that we'd avoid the drinkers, though, because we didn't want anything to do with those aggressive boneheads. So our overall plan was to get out of the H scene and dive back in among the potheads. Ditlev wanted to look for work again, too. He said, "I'll just go back to my old boss and say that I kind of fucked up, but that now I've got my head screwed on the right way again." He's always been really understanding. I'll stand my apprenticeship as a pipe fitter all over again. I said that I wanted to totally focus on school again and maybe even finish high school and, after that, go for the college entrance exams. Then my mom came back in with a surprise for us. She'd been to her doctor, and he'd prescribed a bottle of methadone for her to take home. Ditlev and I took 20 drops each, just as the doctor had instructed. We didn't take any more because we knew it had to last all week. With methadone in our system, we felt even better. The withdrawal symptoms were much less intense now. My mom kept feeding us a steady supply of pudding, ice cream, and anything else we needed or had a craving for. She brought us piles of stuff to read, too. Tons of comics. I used to think that comics were boring. Now I read them together with Ditlev. We didn't just skim over them like we used to. We read every panel carefully and only stopped when something really got to us and made us laugh hysterically. We were still improving on the third day, too. That being said, we were also always on something. Methadone, Valium, and a lot of wine, too. We felt pretty good, even though our poisoned bodies sometimes still revolted against their lack of heroin. On the night of the third day, after what had been a long time, we slept together again. When you're on heroin, your sex drive really takes a hit. It was the first time, since the first time, that Ditlev and I had slept together without any heroin. It was unbelievable. We realized that we hadn't experienced anything like that in a long, long time. We lay in bed together for hours, sweating still, but happy just to be able to touch each other. We probably could have made it out of bed on the fourth day, but we didn't bother trying. We stayed in bed an extra 3 days, sleeping together, drinking wine, taking Valium when we needed to, and leaving all the other details to my mom. Going through withdrawal wasn't that bad, we thought. We were happy to have finally made it to the other side. On the 7th day, we got up again. My mom was so happy that we'd recovered and that it was all over. She kissed us both. My feelings about my mom had started to change over the course of the previous week. I felt something like genuine friendship and gratitude toward her. And of course I was also very happy about having Ditlev back in my life. I thought that he was just about the best boyfriend ever. I mean, I loved the way he decided to join up with me in getting clean. He didn't even think twice about it. And the fact that all the stress and pain of withdrawal didn't break us up, as happened with most other couples, was also unbelievably cool. In fact, if anything, our connection was even deeper now. We told my mom that we wanted to get some fresh air. She agreed that it would be a good idea since at that point Ditlev and I had spent an entire week holed up in a tiny room. So, where to? Ditlev asked. I looked at him, clueless. I really didn't have any idea. It just now occurred to us that we didn't have anywhere to go anymore. All of our friends were heroin junkies. And all the places we knew, where we somehow felt at home, were part of the heroin scene. We didn't even know where the potheads hung out anymore. After Ditlev asked where we should go, I suddenly didn't feel so good anymore. We were out of methadone. That must have been the reason why we'd gotten so restless and wanted to go outside. Not having a destination in mind, however, made things even worse. I suddenly felt really drained, really empty. We might have gotten off H, but now we didn't know what to do next. We walked to the subway without talking about a destination. It was like we were on automatic pilot. There was an invisible thread pulling us along, without us being aware of it. And then we were standing at Zoo Station. Ditlev finally said something: "We really should say hi to Axel and Bernd. Otherwise they'll think we're dead or in jail or something." "Of course," I said, full of relief. "We have to at least tell them what it's like to go absolutely cold turkey. And maybe we could talk them into getting clean, too." It only took a second to find Axel and Bernd. They had a lot of dope, after a good day with customers. Ditlev told them about what we'd been through, and both of them said how awesome it was that we'd actually done it. After that, though, Axel and Bernd said that they were going back to their apartment to shoot up. Ditlev looked at me, and I looked back at him. We caught each other's eyes and started grinning. Looking back, I remember thinking, already, on the first day. That's crazy. But Ditlev said, "We can still shoot up every now and then, you know. Heroin's still a great time, in moderation. We just have to be careful. We have to watch it, so we don't get hooked again. Because I'm not about to do a total withdrawal all over again, sure, a shot every once in a while. I'm cool with that. We just can't let ourselves get hooked again." We had absolutely no ability to take stock of what we were actually getting into. It was like the reasoning pans of our brains had been shut down. The only thing I could think about was that next shot of heroin. Ditlev said to Axel, "Can you spot us some? You'll get it back soon, no problem." Axel and Bernd told us we should really think about it first. Then they said that they'd get clean next week, too, just like we did. They just had to get some methadone lined up first. They thought it'd be cool to be able to go to work again and just shoot up every once in a while. 2 hours after we'd left my mom's apartment, Ditlev and I were using again, and totally doped up. Arm in arm we strolled down the Kurfürstendamm. It was such a good feeling, to be high and not have to worry about getting anywhere. Instead, we could just walk around. We didn't even have to worry about getting a supply for the next morning. "Well," Ditlev said to me, with a smile on his face, "tomorrow morning we'll wake up, do a few stretches, and start our day off right, without any H." We actually seriously believed we had recovered. Our first mistake was in thinking that over the course of the past week at my mom's, all that pain and puking had been proof of a real, complete withdrawal. And sure, the poison had left our bodies, the heroin at least. But we'd been busy replacing one drug with another. With lots of others, in fact, with methadone, Valium, and whatever else was on hand. And we hadn't wasted a single thought on what we would do afterward. My mom was similarly naive. She felt optimistic that we'd gotten over it once and for all. And how could she have known any better? Actually, we should have known better because we'd already heard stories from a lot of other people about the process of withdrawal. But we weren't that interested in what was really going on with us. We were still incredibly naive. We didn't care what other people had been through, or what other people thought they'd learned. We knew best. For the next month or so, it looked like we were actually pulling it off. Neither one of us had to do any hustling. We only shot up when someone treated us or when we had some extra cash. At the same time, we were getting more and more impatient every day about finding someone who treat us to a shot or who had a few extra dollars to loan us. We were anxious for our taste, but not ready to admit it. It was a good time for us. I didn't have to go back to school yet, because my mom wanted me to be happy and relaxed during my first few weeks off heroin. She even let Ditlev stay over with us. I got to know a totally new side of Ditlev and fell deeper and deeper in love with him, if that was even possible. He was carefree and happy and full of ideas. It seemed like we were always having fun. And if we weren't, at least we pretended. We went into a giant park nearby called the Grunewald 28 and took long walks. Sometimes we took my 2 cats with us and let them climb the trees there. We made love almost every night. Life was awesome. Sometimes we were clean for a couple of days, and sometimes we stayed doped up for 3 days running. If we got our hands on a big enough stash, we left the nasty heroin scene behind as fast as we could. We liked to head over to the Kurfürstendamm and mix in with all the normal 9-to-5ers over there. It was fun to feel like we were pan of that world but also different. That was the way we had of proving to ourselves and to others that we weren't junkies, we just shot up sometimes. We could still join in and be a part of real, everyday life. We also liked to get high and go to the lame clubs that the teenagers and tourists loved. We sat there, totally high, thinking we were just like everybody else. Sometimes we would decide to just stay home for the whole day instead. We'd sit by the window, looking out, and telling each other stories. We'd also try to pick the leaves from these sickly old trees that were growing in front of our house. Ditlev would hold on to my legs, and I'd lean way out of the window and see how many I could grab. We made out, ran around, read, and were mostly just kind of silly. Our future was never a serious topic. But every once in a while, I had these pangs of real anxiety. It was almost like a sickness that attacked me whenever a dark reality seemed to intrude on our little fantasy lives. It would happen whenever I had an argument with Ditlev. It didn't matter how trivial the fight happened to be, I just couldn't deal with it. I had to push everything serious far away from me, and I was always worried about freaking out about some stupid little thing. Whenever I started to have these feelings of anxiety or insecurity, I'd start to have the hunger again. Because with one shot of heroin, the problem would be gone. Eventually, we had a real problem. My mom's boyfriend, Klaus, was upset about Ditlev. He said that the apartment was too small for a 4th person, especially if that 4th person was a stranger. It was hard for Mimum to argue with that, and there wasn't anything I could say to change his mind. It made me feel so powerless. It was just like the time when Klaus ordered me to give up my dog. In a flash, my peaceful, awesome, easy life was over with. I had to go back to school, and Ditlev wasn't allowed to sleep over anymore. Back in school, it felt like I'd never left. It didn't seem like I'd missed anything, anyway, but I'd given up on school a long time ago. I had one new problem though, smoking. Even I wasn't on age, I smoked 4 to 5 packs a day, chain smoking one cigarette after another. And now I couldn't even make it through the first class of the day without a smoke. I had to leave and go to the bathroom now. That first morning at school I literally smoked until I threw up. I puked into a wastebasket. I could hardly spend any time in class. For the first time in weeks, I didn't see Ditlev. The next day, after school, I started to get nervous and took the subway over to station. There was my Ditlev, waiting for his next customer. It was sickening to see him back at the station, looking out for customers. But Ditlev said that he was completely broke. And anyway, he had no idea what else he should do. He was sleeping at Axel and Burns again and working the streets at Zoo Station and shooting up again, every day. If I wanted to see Ditlev, that's where I needed to be. He was the only person I had. I didn't believe I could live without him. So I went back, every day back to Zoo Station. Christiane's mom on the Sunday when I came across the bloodstains in the bathroom and checked Christiane's arms for track marks, the light bulb finally went on. It felt like someone had kicked me in the stomach. In a way, I guess, it was just time for me to pay the piper. I'd raised Christiane a certain way, and I'd been proud of my parenting skills. But in the end, it was all wrong. I wanted to avoid the mistakes my own dad had made, but I'd made my own mistakes instead. When Christiane started to go to the sound, I wasn't exactly happy about it, but her friend Cassie and the other teens from the center house all seemed to go there pretty regularly. So I told myself, okay, so why shouldn't Christiane go there too? The kids all raved about the sound. It thought back on all the harmless things that my dad prohibited when I was a girl, and that was enough for me. I was still sticking with that permissive style of parenting when Christiane introduced me to her boyfriend Dittelf. She'd met him at the sound, and he made a really good impression on me. He knew how to be polite, he had good manners, and he just generally seemed like a well-meaning kind of kid. Just a really sweet guy. And I thought it was normal for Christiane at her age, that she would be so head over heels in love. More than anything else, I was just glad that she'd hooked up with a decent guy. I could see that he really cared for Christiane. If you had told me back then that they were already using heroin, I would have said you were crazy. The fact was, aside from Christiane's crush, I didn't notice anything at all unusual going on with her. On the contrary, she seemed to be calmer and better adjusted after a phase of real defiance. She even seemed to be doing better in school. After she'd finished with her school day, she would usually call me and tell me what she was up to. She'd say that she was going to see friends or picking up Dittelf from work. And I had no problem with any of that. On weekdays she was usually home for dinner. And when she was running late, she'd call and even then generally arrive home in an hour or so. When she was late, she told me it was because she'd stopped at the center house or met up with friends. She started lending a hand around the house again, and when she did I'd try and give her something in return, like a snack, or a record, or a little increase on her allowance. Klaus didn't think that was a good idea though. He thought I should focus more on myself and said that Christiane was just taking advantage of me. Maybe he was right, in retrospect. But I always felt a little guilty for what Christiane had already been through at that point and was just trying to do something nice for her. I wasn't seeing things clearly back then. Klaus also thought it was a bad idea for me to let Christiane stay overnight at her girlfriend's places. He never thought she was telling the truth about that stuff. But it wasn't my style to go spying on her or checking out her stories. That was the kind of thing my dad would do, even though I was never really up to anything. Then one day Christiane told me that she had slept with Dittelf. "Mom," she said, "he was so sweet to me, you can't even imagine." When she told me that, I thought that was the reason why she always wanted to stay overnight at her girlfriends' houses. And really, so what, I thought. I didn't think it was a huge deal. From that point on, I occasionally allowed her to sleep over at Dittelf's. I mean, how could I have prevented them from sleeping together anyway? Everyone in the media is always talking about how kids mature earlier these days, and it seems like the general feeling is that their sexuality shouldn't be suppressed. I agree with that. Christiane at least had a steady boyfriend. Other girls in the neighborhood seemed to just go from one guy to the next. So her steady relationship with Dittelf was reassuring to me. It showed some maturity. On the other hand, if I really wanted to be honest, I sometimes got the feeling that something was really wrong. Especially when it came to her other new friends from the sound. She told me that they sometimes did drugs, but she didn't talk about hard stuff like heroin. But I knew they'd smoke pot and had even taken acid. She described some really horrible things to me, like the fact that her friend Babsy was already an addict. But she talked about it all as if she was disgusted and turned off by it. I never would have thought that she herself was involved in any way. When I asked her why she was hanging out with these kinds of people, she said, "Oh Mom, I feel so sorry for them. Most people don't want anything to do with them. So when someone does take the time to listen to them, they are so grateful and happy. They really need help. Christiane had always been altruistic, so that made sense to me. But now I can see that she was actually talking about herself. One night, in the middle of the week, she didn't come home until 11 p.m. When she got back she just said, "Don't be mad at me. I went to a release center with some of my friends." I asked her what a release center was, and she told me, "Well, it's where we go to try and get all the druggies to lay off for a while." Then she added, "God, if I ever got addicted," and suppressed a laugh. I stared at her, shocked. But then she broke in again with, "I'm just kidding, Mom. Everything's okay." "And what about Ditolf? Is he okay?" At that point, Christiane seemed offended. Of course. That would be the last thing on his mind. He doesn't care about drugs. That was in the winter of '76. From then on I was seriously concerned that there was something very wrong, but I was trying to ignore that feeling. I didn't listen to my boyfriend either. By that point, he was absolutely convinced that Christiane was taking some serious drugs. But I wasn't ready to accuse her of anything yet. What kind of a mother wants to admit that she's failed? That everything she's done was for nothing? As assault, I just kept insisting that my daughter would never do that. Still, I tried to rein Christiane in a little. But there were many times when she wouldn't show up for dinner, even though I told her we'd be expecting her, and I didn't know quite what to do at times like those. Where could I have gone looking for her? Even without my impressive talent for self-deception, I never would have suspected that she was hanging out at Zoo Station. I was always glad when she called to let me know that at least she'd be home soon. I just didn't know how to handle her anymore. But sometimes she'd respect my rules. Sometimes when her friends called, she'd tell them proudly, "No, I'm not allowed to come out today. I'm staying home." It didn't seem to bother her. That was the contradictory thing about her. On the one hand, she was infuriatingly rude and disrespectful, refusing to talk to me and doing whatever she wanted, and on the other hand she respected me when I set clear limits. But by then, it was already too late. I got my wake-up call in late January 1977. It was horrible. I wanted to go into the bathroom, but the door was locked. That was unusual for us. Christiane was inside and wouldn't open the door. All of a sudden, I just knew. And for the first time, I faced up to my history of self-deception. Otherwise, how could I have known what was going on in the bathroom? I started banging on the door, but she wouldn't open up. I was absolutely fuming. I began yelling at her, demanding that she open the door. Finally she burst out past me. I caught a glimpse of a blackened spoon and blood spatters on the wall. That was it. I knew all the signs from reading the newspaper stories. All my boyfriend said was, "So, do you believe me now?" I ran after her. "Christiane," I said in a shaky voice, "what have you done?" I was devastated, completely at a loss. My whole body was shaking. I didn't know whether to break down and cry or scream at her. I had to talk to her first. She was crying her heart out and didn't want to answer. I asked, "Did you shoot up?" She didn't answer. She was sobbing so hard she couldn't talk. I grabbed her arms, forced them straight out beneath her, and saw them, track marks on both her arms. But it didn't look too bad. Really it didn't. She didn't have any bruises, and I could only see 2 or 3 needle marks, one of them fresh. That one was still red. And then, through her tears, she confessed. I wanted to die. I really wanted to just leave it all behind and die. I was so distraught that I couldn't think. I didn't know what to do. "What are we going to do now?" I asked. "Actual," asked Christiane, as if she had the answer. Because I myself was completely at a loss. So this was the nightmare I had wanted to avoid. This was the truth that I couldn't face up to. Couldn't accept. But I didn't know the signs to look out for. I hadn't noticed any apathy in Christiane. She was mostly cheerful and perky. The only thing that stood out over the previous few weeks was that sometimes, when she came home late, she'd go straight into her room. I just thought it was because she felt bad about coming home late though. After I'd calmed down a bit, we talked about what to do next. As we considered the various options, Christiane revealed that Ditlev was also addicted to heroin. It made sense for both him and Christiane to get clean together. Otherwise, whoever hadn't quit would keep pulling the other one down again. That made sense to me. We decided that both of them should clean up their act together at our place. Christiane seemed very open and honest about the whole situation. She confessed that Ditlev had also been involved in the prostitution scene at Zoo Station in order to earn the money they needed for the drugs. I was stunned. It didn't occur to me that she might be doing the same thing. At the time, I thought her love for Ditlev would have precluded it. She said that he was always able to earn enough on his own for both of them. Christiane kept insisting that she really wanted to get off the stuff. So that same night we went off looking for Ditlev. That's when I saw, for the first time, all of these sad, emaciated figures, walking up and down between the trains. And Christiane said, "That's not how I want to end up. Just look at them all." She still looked relatively good. That almost reassured me. After a couple hours of searching, we gave up and went to Ditler's father's house. He was aware of Ditler's heroin addiction, but he didn't seem aware that Christiane had reached the same point herself. I jumped right down his throat. "Why didn't you tell me anything?" I asked him. He said that he was too embarrassed. Ditler's dad seemed relieved. He wanted to help financially. Until now, he'd tried in vain to get help for his son. It must have seemed like a real blessing to him, our interceding like this. I was so self-assured I even surprised myself. It felt good to take some control of the situation, even if I had no idea what actually lay ahead of me. The next day I went out to get some professional advice. The first place I tried was the youth welfare office. I told them that my 14-year-old daughter was a heroin addict and asked what I should do. They weren't very helpful. Put her in a home for other kids with the same problems, they said. I told them that that was totally out of the question. Christiane would feel like I just wanted to get rid of her. And besides, they couldn't even recommend an appropriate place. They would have to do some research, and it would take a while. It's hard to find a good spot for kids who aren't very well behaved, they told me. That's not what this is about, I replied. She isn't hard to manage. She's just addicted to heroin. They just kept looking at me and shrugging their shoulders. Their final advice was to take Christiane to a family counselor. When I suggested this to Christiane, she just said, "That's ridiculous, they don't have a clue. What I need is rehab therapy." But the authorities and bureaucrats didn't offer anything like that. I went from one clinic to another. I went to the Technical University, to the Caritas 29 office, and I forget where else. I just didn't know how to deal with this problem myself. The advisors didn't think a home withdrawal would work out well. Without therapy, they said, just taking the heroin away from her wouldn't make a big difference. But because Christiane was still so young, it wasn't viewed as totally hopeless. The point turned out to be moot anyway. They didn't have a spot for her in any of their therapy programs. Maybe in 3 months, they said. Before I left, they gave me some dietary advice to counteract the nutritional deficiencies that she had probably developed. At the end of a week, both Ditlev and Christiane appeared to have gotten over all their withdrawal symptoms. Neither of the two tried to con me, and neither tried to run away. I dared to hope. After the 8th day, I was sure that it was over. Thank God, I thought to myself, she's made it. Christiane went back to school again a few days later and supposedly participated regularly as well. But then she started to roam again. I was comforted somewhat by the fact that she would at least tell me where she was going. She gave solid, detailed information. When she called at 8 p.m., she would say, "Mom, I'm in this or that cafe. I met up with this or that person. I'll be home soon." I'd now been warned. I kept checking her arms, but didn't find any new needle marks. I told her that she couldn't stay at Dittler's over the weekend anymore, but I wanted to show her that I trusted her, so I let her stay out a little later on Saturday nights. I was suspicious, but I still didn't know exactly how to act. I tortured myself, agonizing over what to do. One was terrified about becoming physically addicted again. But when Ditlev was doped up and I was sober, there was no connection between us. We were like strangers. That's why I started shooting up with Ditlev again. And yet while we were driving the needles into our arms, we kept telling ourselves that we would never fall back into our old ways ever again. Once again, we convinced ourselves that we weren't addicted and could stop whenever we wanted, while at the same time, we were frantically making sure that we'd have enough dope left over for the morning. The whole fucking cycle started up all over again. Strangely, even though we'd been through it all before, we couldn't tell just how badly we were in deep shit again because of our delusion that now we had things under control. Just like before, at first, Ditlev was the only one working zoo station. It wasn't very long, however, before I joined him there. Things went well at the beginning though. I ran into a lot of my old regulars, and so the jobs weren't too revolting. On the first day that I was back on the streets, Ditlev took me along to meet this new guy, Georgian. Georgian was pretty well known in the Berlin business world. He was loaded and lunched with senators, so he was very well connected, and even though he was over 30, he still seemed kind of young. He talked the way we talked and seemed to understand the issues we were dealing with. He wasn't just your ordinary businessman or your usual stuffy manager type. So this was my first time in Georgian's apartment. When we got there, there were about a dozen people. They were all gathered around a giant wooden table that had candles in silver holders and expensive bottles of wine. Everyone was relaxed, and the conversation seemed to be flowing easily. It was immediately apparent that these people were pretty smart. Georgian was leading the discussion, and I thought, man, this guy is sharp. It was also hard to ignore the fact that he was living in such an amazing apartment, packed with first-class stuff. And despite everything, he was still so laid back, easygoing, and generous. We were treated like we really belonged, despite the fact that we were obviously the only junkies there. After a little small talk, one of the couples asked if they could go take a shower. Georgian said, "Of course, what else are they here for?" The showers were right next to the living room. The first couple went in, and a few other people followed after them. A short while later, they came back in, naked and asking about towels. It seemed like a pretty cool environment to me, where everyone seemed to get along with everybody else and up for anything. I felt like Ditlev and I could live like this someday, in a first-class apartment, and invite totally cool friends like this. A few people were already naked or with just small towels around their waists, and they were walking around and touching each other and starting to make out. One couple went into the bedroom, onto the huge bed there. The bedroom happened to be connected to the living room by a wide passageway, so you could look right in. This couple undressed and began to kiss, and soon they were joined by a number of the other guests, who crawled right into the huge bed with them. There were guys with guys, and guys with girls, everything. Some of the people there didn't even make it to the bed, they were going at it right at the table. but I'd realized that I was attending a certified orgy well before things had gone that far. The guests obviously wanted Ditlev and me to join them, but I wasn't into it. I didn't want to be groped by just anybody. I wasn't necessarily opposed to what was going on or grossed out by it. In fact, I was even a little turned on by how they were all having fun together and how chill everything was. But that's exactly why I wanted to be alone with Ditlev. Ditlev and I went to a separate room and started making out. Suddenly Georgian appeared next to us, watching. It didn't bother me though, because, for starters, I felt so safe, but also because I knew he was paying us for this. I only hoped that he wasn't going to join in. But Georgian just watched. While Ditlev and I had sex, he jerked off. And then, when we left later on, my mom was still expecting me at home. He casually slipped Ditlev a 100-mark note. Young addicts working the Kurfürstenstrasse in Berlin. Werner H., 21, and Michael S., 21, at the Kurfürstendamm subway station. Werner H., I started shooting up at 16. I was sentenced to 3 years in jail, and after that no one had time for me anymore. I don't stand a chance anymore, I'm in way deep. Michael S., I started when I was 15. But I don't want to lose hope. I just have to find something that I can hold on to, that I can believe in, and then maybe I'll be able to get clean. Babel W., 21, at the Eisenach Youth Hostel. I shot up for the first time when I was 13 years old. Working as a hooker is disgusting, but for girls it's the only way we know to get the money we need. If you want to quit, you need to have a reason. And right now I just don't. Karen S., 17, in front of the public bathrooms at Pulobojan, I started shooting up when I was 13. When my mom realized what was going on, she called the police. She really thought that I would stop using in jail. But it was just as easy to score dope in there as it was on the street. When you start as early as I did, you don't really have a chance. A typically desolate apartment in the Basilstrasse, Basil Street, Berlin. Almost every heroin addict sells off anything valuable he owns right away, from the iron and ironing board, to the stereo system, to help buy himself heroin. Rudy H., 17, and Dirk L., 18, selling themselves at Zoo Station. Rudy says, I've been shooting up for 3 months now, and prostitution is the only way that I can get the money I need. Dirk had been shooting up for 1.5 years, once I went into detox and got a job, but then my boss found out about my past and fired me. I'm not afraid of the physical withdrawal, only of what comes after. Georgian became a regular. He was by, and most of the time we visited him together. I would entertain him up top and Ditlev would attend to things down below. We always got 100 marks for that. Sometimes one of us would go alone, too, for 60 marks. It goes without saying that Georgian was, on the one hand, a John like any other, not the best, but not that gross either. At the same time, he was the only customer for whom I felt something like friendship. I respected him. I liked talking to him. He was interesting and often had some real insights. He lived in the real world, and he lived well. I especially admired the way he handled money. That was the thing about him that interested me the most. He told me once about how, once he'd invested in something, the money almost seemed to grow by itself. He was incredibly generous. He didn't pay anyone else who attended his orgies, but once I was around when a younger guy asked him for a couple thousand marks, for a Mini Cooper. Georgian didn't get into a big discussion about it. Instead, he just wrote out a check and said, "Here." Georgian was the only customer who would sometimes have me over without asking for anything from me. I sometimes watched TV with him at night. Even I did, it seemed like all was right again with the world, at least while I was there. Meanwhile, it didn't take very long for Ditlev and me to settle right back into our old routine. We never went to the clubs anymore, they were for kids. So when I wasn't hanging around Zoo Station, I was at Kurfürstendamm. Sometimes there would be like 100 junkies just on the small subway platform there. That's where the dealing happened. There were a lot of Johns there looking to take advantage of some desperate junkie, but that didn't bother us. It was just the place where we met up. When I was there, I'd walk from group to group, talking with the others. I felt like I really mattered when I was making my rounds on that platform, right below the Kurfürstendamm. I felt like a star. I'd see the old ladies heading back from the department stores with their bags full of junk, staring at us with this disgusted, frightened look in their eyes, and I'd think, oh my God, we have it so much better than they do. Our lives might be hard, and it might not be the safest way to live, the prognosis wasn't good, anyway, but at the same time, we wouldn't have it any other way. For me at least, I liked it like that. I mean, think about the money I was making. Just for the heroin alone I needed 100 marks a day. With all the other expenses included, an average month cost about 4,000 marks. That's what I had to bring in, and it was a lot, but I still managed it. The way I looked at it was, I'm making more than a lot of my clients do, and I'm only 14 years old. Working the streets and turning tricks was pretty shitty work, obviously, but when I was on dope it didn't bother me that much. And anyway, I kind of ripped off my customers because they didn't get much for their money. I still called the shots. Sex was out of the question. But I was a pretty small player in the overall scene. I was in awe of the guys who said they needed 4 grams of dope every day. That worked out to 500 to 850 marks worth of heroin every day, but they almost always managed to get what they needed. So they were making more than almost anyone in Berlin at the time, and they were doing it without getting caught by the cops. And even if I wasn't at their level yet, I could still walk up to them at Kurfürstendamm, and they would talk to me. Anyway, that's what I was thinking at the time, back in February and March of 1977, when I was still okay. I didn't feel great, but still, I hadn't hit rock bottom yet. I still believed the lies I was telling myself. I'd slipped right back into the life of a junkie. I thought I was really cool. I wasn't afraid of anything. Before heroin, I was afraid of everything, of my father, and then later of my mom's boyfriend, of my shitty school and the teachers there, of landlords, traffic cops, and even subway ticket checkers. Now I felt untouchable. I wasn't even scared of the undercover cops who prowled around the station. And I had a reason to be cocky. At that point, I'd gotten through every police raid without so much as a scratch. Back then I was also hanging around with some other users, junkies, really, who I thought were somehow still in control. Ats and Lufo were like that. Ats was my first boyfriend. The only guy I'd had a close relationship with before Dittelf. I used to be crazy about him. In 1976, Lufo, like Ats and Dittelf, was part of our pot-smoking clique at the Sound. Ats and Lufo got stuck on dope right before I did. They got an apartment, and it looked like they'd made it. The apartment had a French bed, a matching couch and recliner set, and wall-to-wall carpeting. Lufo even had a totally legit, minimum wage job at Schwarzkopf. Both of them claimed that they'd never been physically addicted to heroin, and that they could go for weeks or even months without shooting up. I believed them, but at the same time, they were always high whenever I hung out with them. Ats and Lufo were my idols. At the time I was worried about sinking back to the state I was in before my first purge. I thought that if Dittelf and I could be as cool as Ats and Lufo were when it came to our habits, then we could also make it like they did and live in an apartment with a French bed, matching couch and recliner sets, and wall-to-wall carpeting. Also, neither of them was aggressive like the other junkies were, and Ats had a really cool girlfriend, too, Simone, who didn't shoot up at all. I thought it was awesome that they were so in love and accepting of each other even though one of them was a user and the other one wasn't. I liked spending time at their place, and sometimes, when I'd had a fight with Dittelf, I slept on Lufo's couch. But one night I came home, and since I was in a good mood and felt like things were going pretty well overall, I stopped in the living room to sit down with my mom. Right away she got up and went to get the paper without saying a word. I could sense what was coming next. She always handed me the paper like that when there was a report about a heroin death. I hated it. I didn't want to read whatever she wanted to show me. But I read the obituary anyway. Glassblower's apprentice Andreas W., 17, wanted to get off drugs. His 16-year-old girlfriend, a nursing student, wanted to help him, but to no avail. The young man died of an overdose in an apartment in Tiergarten, which his father had furnished for the young couple for several thousand marks. The story didn't sink in right away, because I didn't want to believe it. But all of the elements were there: apartment, glassblower's apprentice, girlfriend, Andreas W. It was Andreas Wixorek, ATS. At first all I could think was, shit. My throat was dry and I felt like I was going to puke. I couldn't understand how ATS could have overdosed. ATS, of all people, who knew just how much dope he could handle and was always cool and in control. I didn't want to let my mom see how upset I was. She had no idea that I was using again. So I took the paper and just went back to my room. I hadn't seen ATS for a long time, but the paper filled me in on his last few days. According to the news story, he'd already been shooting up way too much during the previous week and had eventually landed in the hospital. His girlfriend, Simone, slashed her wrists right after that, but both of them survived. Then, the day before ATS died, he went to the police and ratted on all the dealers he knew, even these two girls who were known as the twins and who always had first-class heroin. Then he wrote a suicide note, which the paper reprinted in full. I'm ending my life because an addict only brings anger, anxiety, bitterness, and despair to his friends and family. He drags everyone else down with him. Please tell my parents and my grandmother that I'm thankful for all they did for me. I'm an absolute zero. To be a junkie means you're the worst of the worst, the bottom of the shit pile. Why do so many kids, so many young people who enter this world so full of life and hope fall into this kind of self-destructive cycle? I hope that my life can at least serve as a warning to someone else who may at some